Good people, this is definitely my favorite case size. Let's pop. This new series from Fractal Design is exciting for multiple reasons. They've simplified things in terms of working with the enclosure, it looking very streamlined, kind of Fractal Design, kind of an NZXT H series, for example, although with the ventilation pattern of Corsair, so a little bit of an identity crisis there, Fractal. The cases come in silent and air versions. We have the POP Mini for micro ATX systems, the standard POP, and the POP XL for those really full tower stuff. Plus we have non-RGB and RGB fans and different color variations for the interior, which is again super fun if you want to experiment things. And they're bringing back the 5¼ drive bays. There's two. It is pretty funny how the return of the 5¼ drive bay is so exciting in 2022. It's probably the most exciting thing about this enclosure. It sits behind this magnetic cover, and we have this hidden compartment onto which you can store a bunch of USB keys, SD cards, keys, whatever else that you might not necessarily need to access all the time, but it's always nice to have with your PC. But there are a few issues with this approach. So first of all, the magnets on this front plastic plate are not very strong, and every time you go to lift the case, you will never be gonna just pop this out, so that's unfortunate. The little box for storage is perfectly designed. It sits nice and flush inside either drive bay, and it's perfect for little compartment stuff. And of course, you can utilize the 5¼ drive bay for additional SD card readers or other card readers, additional front I/O. Fan controllers are becoming a bit more popular these days, plus external hot swap 2.5 or 3.5 inch drive capacity. So lots of optional things in here aside from having an actual optical drive. Also, if you're one of those savages that keeps their system on the floor, I mean, good luck accessing this compartment. So I would say this whole design is better kept on the desk. Welcome to the light, where wings fly silent and constantly impress with performance. What? The wings of the light have beautiful circular showcase?
I'm just here for some fans.
This diffusion is unlike anything you've seen before.
I mean, I've seen RGB fans before.
Yeah, but these are ARGB from Be Quiet.
You're saying this is their first RGB fan.
Must be good, right? We have 120s, 140s, high speed, and standard versions too.
There's also the 3-pack with a hub.
That is right. Impress your inner self with the new light wings so you can fly into the Be Quiet light wings. Check them out below. Design-wise, they're definite remnants of the Meshify series with the front panel. There is this hexagon texture pattern that is only visible at certain light angles. Otherwise, I thought this was just plain flat mesh that is metal. The porosity on here is not as much as on the Landcool or the Phanteks series, but it is Fractal Design we're talking about, so they've gone with something a bit more conservative that also will act as your dust filter. Just a word of caution when removing the side panels, the tempered glass slides back and there's nothing holding it in place, just some pegs that helps you align the panel into the frame. I'm mentioning this because the rear side panel has the same mechanism, but it also has a slip at the bottom that helps to keep the panel angled in position. So make sure not to confuse that, because the tempered glass does not have that. And also, I am using the silent model here as a demonstration, which has some noise dampening foam on this panel and also on the top to keep things a bit more silent. Another reason I say these bays are optional is because we have two hard drive caddies right behind it. So if you're installing anything that's longer than, let's say, a small fan controller, it's gonna bump into those drive caddies. So we can move at least one of them to behind this whole space here, and you can still utilize additional storage and have one of the caddies either on the floor or right below the power supply shroud. I feel like they've done a good job with this hard drive bracket that can mount both an SSD and a hard drive with these Mickey Mouse ears for installation, so you can move the hard drive in the upper position to the lower position, and when two are installed, this will not fit on the side. It sticks out way too much. You cannot close the side panel. So this is for hard drive installation in the basement only. Here's also the combined dual SSD caddy behind the motherboard tray. It is easily removable, and if you don't use it, clear up some room for cables. So storage is not its main strength, but it's adequate. This SSD bracket can also be mounted in the front chamber if you want to clear up some room behind the motherboard tray. Just in this orientation, neither SSD is in an optimal position for cable management for both for SATA and power, so you just have to route everything into this cutout. The lack of the cutout on the power supply shroud is a compromise in two ways. Number one is that you cannot mount those 5¼ inch reservoir / pump combos because there's no way to route those tubes back into this main chamber. And number two is with fan configuration at the front. You can only do a 240 or 280 mil radiator and their respective fans. You cannot do a 360. There is room at the front, it's just there's no mounting holes in the frame. Now for the $89 price point, let me know if you agree. I don't think the I/O is exactly adequate. It's good that we have dual USB 3s, dedicated audio jacks, power button, and a lighting button, but a USB-C is missing. It is an optional $10 to $20 accessory depending on where you live, and you have to route this yourself, so not that big of a deal, it's not that expensive. But the bigger issue for me is this orientation. Look at how much room we're wasting at the front here for potential cooling capacity. At the top here, you can only mount up to a 240 radiator, and that's kind of limiting, I would say, for an $89 enclosure that is still fairly compact. And I get that the POP XL exists that caters to mounting everything and being super spacious, but still, I find this to be a really big negative. To me, it looks like this whole top area was an afterthought because we have these extender metal brackets for the radiator at the top. You cannot even find this stuff in the user manual, and usually their user manuals are top-notch, but it seems like they included this piece of paper so you can install a 240 radiator at the top, because otherwise it's way too close to the motherboard area. And using these metal extenders, you can put the 240 radiator slightly closer to the TG panel, and that is the only way you can install a radiator at the top. That's not how usually Fractal design works, so someone messed up. All right, so the interior for an $89 enclosure is quite basic. They're definitely banking on the mesh factor at the front and also the different color options as like the selling factor, because we don't even have rubber grommets beside the motherboard tray. The motherboard tray is ATX only, no E-ATX, which for me is perfectly fine. This is tailored towards compact builders anyway. CPU tower height and GPU clearance is perfectly fine for the size, but the biggest drawback for me on the interior is that front fan section. This design introduces so much hassle because if you need to have the fans outside of the frame like we have mounted on the default fans like this, you can only install them from the inside, and that means that this whole area has to be relatively clear. But if you're mounting, let's say, a radiator and a set of fans on this side of the frame, it's easy access from the front, but then you lose more clearance for the GPU area, and that becomes a little bit messy. The included 120mm fans require some ninja cable management work, but it's a good thing that we can daisy chain all of them both on the power side with a 3-pin connector. So this is not a PWM fan hub, which kind of sucks, but the addressable 5-volt connector can be just also daisy chained together, and you can either plug this directly into your motherboard or you can plug it into the case hub so that you can switch between different lighting effects with the button up top. Unfortunately, one of my fans arrived broken. It is not spinning regardless of where I plug it in. It is receiving power for the illumination, so that's nice and pretty. I will be swapping it out for a non-RGB fan from the silent version, which has the same CFM and RPM specs, so for temperature testing, it's not going to be a problem. As for all the color profiles, we have plenty of colors to choose from. A few effects by holding the button for 2 seconds that cycles between all the different effects. I really like the approach of plugging all the default case lighting, whatever that may be, into the case itself, bypassing any software that your motherboard may come with. I also really appreciate how the power button follows the exact color and pattern, and also the gradient even of whatever you set. So for example, right now, everything's switching. You can actually see those colors transforming on the power button. A little attention to detail. Really appreciate it. Cable management in this enclosure is super straightforward. It's a basic case, so what are we expecting? But if you have not yet worked with soft cables, do yourself a favor, spend extra money on a power supply that comes with soft cables by default, and you'll thank me later. I mean, look at how soft this 24-pin cable is. It's awesome when you don't have that much room exiting behind the motherboard tray from the rubber grommet or whatever space you're exiting from. Same thing with our PCIe cables. They're super soft, don't require much effort at all, and this is really important for the 8-pin cable, especially for this enclosure, because there isn't that much height clearance from the cutout, and so the softer the cable, the better. So I would say the entire user experience around the POP is underwhelming. It doesn't necessarily bring anything totally fresh to the table. We'll get to the temperatures later, and unless you need a 5.25-inch drive bay at the bottom for whatever reason, this is probably the only 2022 release that you will find it on, unless you go back and get something in the older generation. Now, when it comes to temperatures, here's one important thing. The Pop Solid is an absolute disaster when it comes to CPU temperatures because the front is totally closed off. It completely chokes those front intake fans. It's a totally different story when we remove the panel and also when we test against the Pop Air. At least there's some airflow going through the Pop Air variant, even though the porosity on that metal mesh is not as good as we find on the Lancool series and the Phanteks series. When it comes to the GPU temperatures, it is absolutely crucial to have a rear exhaust fan to remove all that exhausted heat from the GPU, and it doesn't really matter which case you go for, temperatures are pretty the same. I also tested how loud these cases are because the Pop Silent, you know, perhaps should give us an indication that it is targeted towards the silent crowd and not the airflow performance crowd. But even though it is slightly quieter both at the front and the side, my trick, if you want something that has good performance and is quiet, is to have a good porosity frame that has good airflow going through it and lowering the RPM on the fans. That's the only way to achieve that nice balance. Instead of brute forcing airflow through a really closed frame, I mean, you're increasing the RPM for the sake of much hotter temperatures. So in conclusion, I would say look into the Corsair 4000D Airflow. That is still one of my favorite mid-towers in terms of user assembly, features, build quality, compatibility with hardware, etc. Or the new G360A from Phanteks that is also encompassing all the same features as before, the P360A, that nice budget tower, but now slightly upgraded into 2022, that I would say outcompete the Pop Air, and the Pop Silent. So sorry, Fractal Design, this one's not for me. All right, guys, I'm Dimitri. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know what you think of the new Pop. I'll talk to you in the next video.